Silliman, who's president of the Arab Gulf States Institute and a former ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much indeed for your time. Just a few weeks ago, an Iranian-backed militia said that the US and the UK are creating unrest between Iraq's Shia groups. You say the opposite, that the US doesn't have that sort of influence in the country anymore.
Adnan, thank you very much. It's a very good question. It's a pleasure to be on TRT World today. The United States actually has been watching mostly from outside as the crisis of division within what the Iraqis call the Shia house has worsened. The Shia political parties in Iraq have broken down with Moqtada al Sadr in one bloc and a group called the Coordination Framework, which are mainline Shia parties, but also some pro-Iran and pro-militia Shia parties in a separate bloc. And that has prevented the constitutional steps toward forming a new government from moving forward. Each has blocked the other. I will also note that there are serious divisions as well within the Iraqi Kurdish political community, with the followers of Masoud Barzani in Erbil and the supporters of President Barham Saleh from Sulaymaniyah also unable to agree on steps forward.
Yeah, well, so we're still waiting for a court judgment to decide on whether the current parliament should be dissolved and new elections held. But from what you're saying, it appears as if you don't believe that elections are actually going to solve the problem.
I think it's probably getting near time to come to an agreement among the major parties to reform and reset the parliament for the specific purpose of dissolving it to hold new elections. Muqtada al Sadr had a very strong political position after the elections with 73 seats in the parliament. But when he could not get his majority government formed in the timeline he wanted, I think he made a major strategic mistake by having his MPs withdraw from the parliament. And most of those seats went to his political opponents in the coordination framework. So he has resorted, as you can see in the video that you're playing, to using his still considerable street power, which has caused clashes mostly between his militia and other Shia militias that oppose what he is trying to do.
Mr. Ambassador, what did you make of 2019 and those protests? Because so many of the analyses I've read said that that really should have been a wake-up call and a turning point for the processes that keep Iraq going in terms of the relationship between the electorate and those that they choose to govern. Right now, 27.2% is the rate of youth unemployment in Iraq. That covers 15 to 24-year-olds. What happened or what didn't happen in 2019 that should have done?
The protests in 2019 really started in 2018 and continued for well over a year. They were mostly young Shia Iraqis from poorer neighborhoods of Baghdad and the south of Iraq, which is predominantly Shia. And it was a protest against the inefficiency and corruption of the current Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. It was a direct challenge to the power of the mainstream Shia political parties, the pro-Iran parties, and it called for a considerable change in the way that Iraq is governed. It did result in a change to the electoral laws, which produced different results in the 2021 elections than in previous elections, where MPs were elected by constituency instead of a party list per province. And that is what permitted Muqtada al Sadr to move forward. But many of those who came out of the protest movement rejected the concept of participation in Iraqi politics, did not stand for election, and were unable to translate the power of the street protests into votes in the parliament after the elections.
What do you make of the popular mobilization forces? I mean, these are dozens and dozens and dozens of militia that have been amalgamated into the popular mobilization forces, because there isn't belief that possibly with these militias and the political entities that they are tied to, it produces a situation in which patronage becomes important, that they can wield their power of patronage over ordinary civilians, and that creates instability. I mean, with the amount of guns and militias around, how can the country move forward politically?
But the popular mobilization forces are not a monolithic bloc, but as you note, a range of dozens of militias or tribally organized groups, most of which are most concerned about getting enough wealth and power for themselves. And the Iraqi government, unfortunately, since certainly 2010, has been based on distribution of patronage, with political parties and powerful forces dividing the spoils of government in consensus governments, never having a real opposition. As I often say, since everybody was in government, nobody really had a stake in the government succeeding. What you see now is the militarization of this process, as mostly Shia and usually pro-Iran, but not always pro-Iran militias compete against each other for political power. And most of the violence this week has been between different militias of the Popular Mobilization Forces and Muqtada al Sadr's Saraya al-Salam, not against the traditional Iraqi security forces or the Interior Ministry.
Ambassador, we haven't talked about what potential influence Iran is having in Iraq, but I want to just bring you back to your time in Iraq and the American presence there. The second Gulf War, the second invasion, began in 2003, and there was the government that was formed after that US-led invasion. There was this alliance between the Americans and the Iranian proxies that were in Iraq at the time. Again, do you not see that being a problem? Because what came after that alliance was more sectarianism, more possibly than Iraq had known for decades.
The main goal that Iran has had, certainly since 2003 within Iraq, has been to maintain the unity of the Shia house, to make sure that the Shia majority of Iraq can continue to rule Iraq from Baghdad, and make sure that Iraq does not become for Iran the kind of physical and economic threat that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was for Iran, as we saw in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The United States has shifted its goals somewhat in Iraq, and now is focused on trying to build Iraqi institutions. So instead of supporting individual candidates or individual parties, we are hoping to see political reforms and economic reforms that open up the private sector to Iraqi domestic investment, make it easier for Iraqis to form government, form businesses and hire people, and make it easier for foreign companies to come in and invest in Iraq. All this has been blocked by the mostly Shia parties that want to keep a hold of their economic interests. I think that the United States is also trying to maintain the strength of the traditional Iraqi armed forces, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Counterterrorism Service, and some parts of the police, as a bulwark against Iranian influence and as an ability to push back against these independent, although legally part of the government security forces called the Popular Mobilization Forces. So again, that has been the American strategy. I think that it's very difficult because Iran has a much broader toolkit, including violence and intimidation, and has been using Iraq to move weapons, missiles, soldiers from Iran through Iraq into Syria and into Lebanon as part of what it calls the axis of resistance to Israel and the United States. And this has made it, this has been its main political message in Iraq. But again, Iran's main goal in Iraq is to try to make sure that it does not become a future enemy of Iraq, and it does not want Iraq to be close to its Arab neighbors. It does not want it to be close to the United States or Europe. It would prefer to have Iraq unstable enough that Iran can have influence, but not so unstable that Iraq collapses. And I think even now in Tehran, Iranians are probably worried about the rise in violence and the potential for greater instability. That is not something that Iran wants. And I would expect Iran to be sending messages to its militias to cease and desist from pursuing violence and to try to work toward calming the situation and, to the extent possible, reunifying the Shia political house.
Ambassador Douglas Silliman, thank you so much indeed, sir.